Welcome to another video from Language Matters, and today I'm looking at a poem, another poem by Wilfred Owen called Anthem for Doomed Youth. This is specifically, of course, for the Conflict anthology which OCR do. I don't think Anthem for Doomed Youth features in the AQA or EdXL syllabus. So I'd like to break down this poem into little chunks, really, sort of bite-sized chunks. It's like all Wilfred Owen's poems, he was heavily influenced by the Romantic poets, and his poetry is very lavish and very dense, really. There's lots of stuff going on there, which I think, as I've said, is a positive, because it means there's a lot of stuff to write about. Now, as before, no matter what exam board you're doing, really, when it comes to writing about poetry or all your literary texts, the focus tends to be on language, form and structure. So they're the things that you really need to highlight and pull out. And also then, obviously, you're doing you'll have to contrast that with another poem. I should be doing videos like that where I contrast these poems a bit further down the road. So anyway, we think about this poem. I mean, context is important as well. I mean, there are some contextual marks to be had. So it's worth mentioning, of course, that Wilfred Owen was a First World War poet who tended to deal with the harsh realities of war. He famously said, my subject is war and the pity of war. And that certainly comes across in this poem, as well as some of his other famous ones like Exposure. Now, we think about the title, I mean, Anthem for Doomed Youth. I mean, doomed as well. It's kind of very much setting the tone for the sort of poetic voice in this poem. And anthem is quite an interesting choice of words. It has two meanings, of course. It can mean a kind of a musical setting of a religious text, but it can also be a kind of a rousing song identified with a cause. So it has two sort of meanings, but the title is quite interesting in that respect. Obviously, we're thinking about the poem structurally. It's separated by an octet and a sestet, 6 lines and 8 lines. It's a Petrarchan sonnet, and the octet very much deals with the battle and it forms a kind of a semantic field of vocabulary to do with sort of war and death specifically. But we're also talking, there's also a semantic field to do with funeral rites, especially when we get to the sestet. Now, the sestet shifts its focus in many respects because it actually focuses upon the pain of separation, and the grieving really is the topic of sestet. Many have said that the rhetorical questions really that are asked are kind of aren't answered in the sestet, so it has that kind of interesting structure to it. So we think about a little bit of context. I mean, this poem is, you can argue that Wilfred Owen inverts the idiom or the idea of the warrior soldier as presented by poets like Rupert Brooke, for example. Famously, Rupert Brooke wrote that heroic poem, If I should die, think only this of me, that there is a corner of a foreign field that 'tis forever England. It's always cited when we think about death of soldiers. However, Rupert Brooke never saw much action. He actually died before it all began. So Wilfred Owen is very much in the thick of it, and his poem reflects the harsh realities of trench warfare. So you could say, as a little bit of get your contextual mark here, you could say Wilfred Owen inverts the idea of the kind of warrior soldier as represented by Rupert Brooke. There's a few contextual marks for you. If we think about the first line, what passing bells for these who die as cattle? The pronoun these is asking us to look at the pile of corpses, really. The passing bells suggesting something transient, and ephemeral. It's something that's passing and perhaps not of significance in many respects. But he's asking, what sort of funeral rites are there for these men who die as cattle? Now, you think about the idea of the warrior soldier, the noble Tommy, and all this idea of fighting for your country. A lot of these men were just blown to smithereens, blown to pieces in the trenches by this huge mechanistic modern warfare with just firing shells. I mean, there was nothing heroic or glorious about it, is what Wilfred Owen is telling us. In fact, that sentiment is contained in the simile, die as cattle. The whole idea, these men are dehumanized by this process. There's nothing heroic about it. But then he answers the question, doesn't he? Only the monstrous anger of the guns. Only the monstrous. I mean, the adjective monstrous here indicates the gravity and the degree of sound involved here. And of course the guns here are personified, so as you've got personification, the anger of the guns. Only the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle. Lovely use of alliteration there. Only the stuttering rifles. You get that alliterative clatter, don't you, with the stuttering rifle's rapid rattle can patter. Hasty, all that sort of repetition of the T sound, with cattle as well. And it's wonderful use of sound as well, because it creates a kind of hard edge, harsh sounds to the first part of this poem, the octet. So you can mention that when you talk about language, form and structure as well. You must mention this. Not to forget the obvious one, of course, the alliteration, rifle's rapid rattle, the repetition of the R sound, which recreates the sound of a machine gun, can patter out their hasty orisons. Now, orisons is an archaic word. It's an archaic word for prayers, saying a prayer. But orisons, it's not as simple as a prayer in the sense you would say an Our Father or something, or a Hail Mary. Orison it tended to be a plea to God, a somewhat lengthy, considered plea to God. So in this case, this uses an archaic term to mean that, and it's superseded, of course, by the adjective hasty, meaning quick, rushed, because of the frantic and chaotic environment of the battlefield or the trenches. So we have to wonder that these prayers are not very heartfelt or sincere. They're just patted out very quickly with a sense of panic. So that's another thing. He's questioning the validity of prayer and funereal rites for these men who are ultimately blown to pieces or slaughtered like cattle, as is contained in the simile in the opening line. And he calls these funeral rites, mockeries, of course. Mockeries is suggesting we get the poetic voice is very much coming out here. His anger is being revealed here. No mockeries now for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill demented choirs of wailing shells. Of course, you've got the, again, personification of the wailing shells, and the choirs. You have a lot of lexis related to religion, of course, and I said funeral rites. And, you know, the choirs, the shells are demented. Again, this personification, this idea of madness, the madness of the situation that they're in. And of course, the words in many ways recreates the sound. I mean, a structural feature you could mention is the way that shells rhymes with bells. Bells, shells. It almost keeps the chiming of the bells going on for longer. It's quite clever in that respect. In the same way, the rather staccato rifle's rapid rattle is used. It's very clever in that respect. So obviously the sestet deals with grief, that sense of grief. We get a contrast. I don't know if I've already said it, but there is a contrast to be found between the very aggressive language of the octet with the almost sad, reflective language used in the sestet, which speaks about grieving and loss, and has almost a feminine quality when we talk about their flowers and tenderness of patient minds, has an almost feminine quality, and is contrasted, juxtaposed quite effectively with the very harsh and aggressive language of the octet. What candles may be held to speed them all? I love the long vowel sounds here, all, in their eyes shall shine the glimmer, their pall. You get long vowel sounds here, which kind of emphasise, I think, a sense of anguish in many respects. In the same way, you get the minds. I like the way the soft m sound is contrasted with the plosive b sound of blinds. And you get the rhyming there. It's a full rhyme, it's not a half rhyme. And it ends on the S, the sibilant S, blinds. So it's almost like it kind of fades away, very much like the memory of the soldiers that are slaughtered like cattle in many respects. So we think about the sestet. What candles may be held to speed them all, not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes. shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The memories of these men have to serve as a kind of a funeral, because there can be no funeral when their bodies are completely absent, obliterated. The pallor of girls' brows. Pallor here is interesting. It's a word that denotes colour, a lack of colour, a paleness, but also reminds us of the word pall. Pall was a cloth that was draped over a funeral, over a coffin. Sorry, so we get those lexis or semantic field related to death all the way through this poem, and of course pall comes at the end of the line here. The pallor of girls' brow should be their pall. This is a metaphor suggesting that a deathly expression on those that they leave behind. Their flowers, the tenderness of patient minds, emphasis on waiting, and waiting for people who are never going to return home, and each slow dusk, a drawing down of blinds. And the alliteration here, dusk, drawing down, the long vowel sound of down, emphasises the kind of a slow motion of pulling down blinds to indicate there's been a death in the house. I'd just like to read it, go through it again, just see if there's any bits I've missed that I'd like to mention. So, what passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, that lovely personification. Only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle, that lovely staccato, alliterative recreating of the guns. It's excellent. Can patter out their hasty orisons. As I said, remember the very harsh alliterative clatter we get with the T sounds in this. No mockeries now for them, nor prayers, nor bells, nor any voice of mourning. It's a poem very much about negation. It's telling us what they do not have. Instead, what they do have is the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells. A lovely use of personification again there. And bugles calling from them from sad shires. I presume sad shires. Shires are sort of parts of England, I think, who are missing them. Bugles summoning them, calling them back. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, perhaps choir boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbye. I think holy perhaps is used ironically here, because there's nothing holy or godly about what's going on. And religion, there is a lot of lexis related to religion, faith in this poem, and rather ironically really, because the environment that Owen is describing here seems completely godless. The pallor of girls' brows should be their pall, their flowers the tenderness of patient minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. Anyway, I shall leave that there. If you've got all that down, you've got a pretty damn good analysis of this poem in terms of language, form and structure, which is your bread and butter, so to speak. That's where your marks are. Plus there's some contextual stuff that I've thrown in as well. If you like these videos, if you've got anything out of this, if it's been of use to you, please click the subscribe button, click on the bell so you get notified when I upload more stuff. I will be trying to upload as much as possible, but I suspect you'll all be finishing your exams in May, June, so I'll be uploading over the summer, so it'll be ready there for September as well for the new kids on the block, so to speak. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, but more important, please do keep studying.